Good morning, good afternoon. We're right at the changing point, so I'll say both. Good morning, good afternoon, Westside. I would like to give a special welcome to Cindy and Roland Johnson for being here this morning. Cindy Johnson is one of probably the people that helped bring me into this work of Parker Palmer, and so it's especially special that she's here to hear me talk about his work. So thank you, Cindy and Roland. I first encountered the work of Parker Palmer in 1995 when I read the book, The Courage to Teach. And I felt a kinship with his words. He talked about the heartbreaking work of an educator that was just oh so rewarding. And especially those teachers who put their whole heart and soul into their work. It can be joyful and heartbreaking. I then got to meet Parker Palmer in 2003 when I became a national facilitator for his work with teachers, helping them hold on to hope in a pretty hopeless system sometimes. And then he expanded his thinking to our democracy, where we hold on to hope for a society that seems very broken at this time. Representative John Lewis, recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, says, "In this book, Parker Palmer urges us to keep on walking, keep on talking, just as we did in the civil rights movement, until we cross our divides together." I will share some of the highlights from his book with you today, some of his wonderful stories to illustrate, and some connections to our UU principles. I'd like to begin with these words that Parker opens the third chapter of Healing the Heart of Democracy, and he uses the words of Terry Tempest Williams. "The human heart is the first home of democracy. It is where we embrace our questions. Can we be equitable? Can we be generous? Can we listen with our whole beings, not just our minds, and offer our attention rather than just our opinions? And do we have enough resolve in our hearts to act courageously, relentlessly, without giving up, ever? Trusting our fellow citizens to join with us in our determined pursuit of a living democracy?" Parker looks at these questions and begins by reframing the word heart for us. The word heart claims its original meaning from the Latin cor and points not merely to our emotions, but the core of the self, that center place where all of our ways of knowing converge. Intellectual, emotional, sensory, intuitive, imaginative, experiential, relational, bodily, among others. The heart is where we integrate what we know in our minds with what we know in our bones, the place where our knowledge can become more fully human. Cor is also the Latin root from which we get the word courage. When all that we understand about ourself and world come together in this place called heart, we are more likely to find the courage to act humanely on what we know. Our personal and political lives include broken hearts also. We all know what that means personally when we have our hearts broken due to failure, loss, betrayal, or death. Politically, we feel brokenhearted when democracy is threatened from within or without. What else could we feel on 9/11? When we find the will of the people is trumped by corporate greed, or there's official corruption. Remember that period right after 9/11 when people around the world were saying things like, "I'm an American with you today, and I understand your pain and your loss as Americans"? In so many parts of the world, the people had a deeply compassionate response. That was a moment of shared heartbreak. Parker offers two views of this brokenheartedness. One is to be broken into pieces when under stress or an unexercised heart can just explode with frustration and fury, that emotion hurled like fragments from a grenade toward the source of the pain. But a heart that has been exercised through conscious engagement is more likely to be broken open instead of apart. This expands its capacity for both suffering and joy. So consider those as we go through and share with you the 5 habits of the heart that Parker describes in this book he offers to begin healing the broken-hearted democracy. He draws these from Alexis de Tocqueville's belief that our habits are more powerful than our laws in sustaining liberty. We, the people, have succumbed today to divide and conquer politics, so we find it difficult or impossible to talk to each other across our lines of difference. When we can't do that, there's no we in we the people. And when there's no we, there's no way to reach even rough consensus on the common good or generate the people power necessary to hold our leaders accountable. Parker estimates that 15 to 20% of the people on the far right, and probably the same number on the far left, are unable to participate in those line-crossing conversations. But that leaves 60% in the middle who can. And in a democracy, that's more than enough to do business. This country was born in conflict. At the Constitutional Convention, you may remember, 30% of the delegates walked out without signing the document. And those who did sign disagreed so fundamentally that they were forced to create a conflict-holding system of government. In fact, they created the first form of government that treats conflict not as an enemy of good social order, but as the engine of better social order. Conflict can be creative, and we have to recover that sensibility. So here are his habits. An understanding that we are all in this together, an appreciation for the value of otherness, an ability to hold tension in life-giving ways, a sense of personal voice and agency, a capacity to create community. So let me expand a little bit on each of those. First, an understanding that we are all in this together. Ecologists, economists, ethicists, philosophers of science, religious, secular leaders have all given voice to this theme. Despite our illusion of individualism and national superiority, human beings are a profoundly interconnected species with each other and with all forms of life, as the global economic and ecological crises reveal in vivid and frightening detail. We must understand the simple fact that we are dependent upon and accountable to one another, including the stranger, the alien other. At the same time, we need to save this notion from the idealistic excess that makes it an impossible dream, urging people to hold a moment-to-moment awareness of their global and even national interconnectedness to mean advice of perfection that can lead to self-delusion, discouragement, or defeat. I would connect this habit with our 7th principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. During this week, consider this habit and our 7th principle as it applies in your life by considering these questions. When do you feel most aware of your interconnection to and interdependence on other people? When do you feel most disconnected? The second habit of heart is an appreciation for the value of otherness. Despite the fact that we are all in this together, we spend most of our lives in tribes or lifestyle groups. Thinking of the world in terms of us and them is one of the many limitations of the human mind that can be overcome only with continued discipline and practice, The good news is that us and them does not need to mean us versus them. Instead, it can take us back to the ancient tradition of hospitality to the stranger, translating into meanings of hospitality that apply to our 21st century lives. This is a tradition that does not blink at the fact that many people will always be strangers to us, or that we will always be the stranger to many others. But the tradition of hospitality affirms the many ways we can receive and learn from the stranger, allowing otherness to enlarge and revitalize our lives, including the kind of otherness that seems alien and even threatening. This kind of hospitality is impossible if we cannot see the creative possibilities that are inherent in our diversity. I believe this habit connects to our UU third principle, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. So again, as you go through this week, consider this habit and the principle as it applies in your life with these questions. Can you think of a time when you realized that someone considered you to be the other? What was that like? Has this been a common experience for you? When was a moment when you encountered someone that you had previously considered an other? The third habit of the heart is the ability to hold tension in life-giving ways. Our inner and outer lives are full of contradictions, from the gap between our own behavior and our aspirations, to the information and ideas we cannot accept because they were counter to our convictions. If we fail to hold them creatively, the non-stop contradictions of our life will frighten and paralyze us and take us out of action. But when we learn to hold them in heart-opening ways, they may open us to new ways of understanding ourselves and the world, enhancing our lives, allowing us to enhance the lives of others. We are imperfect and broken beings who live our lives in an imperfect and broken world. But the genius of the human heart lies in its capacity to hold tension in ways that energize and draw us forward instead of tearing us apart. Most of us do this. We do create tension holding in our private lives. It's not a skill unfamiliar. In fact, good parents know all about creatively holding tension in relation to their children. Anyone who has ever raised a teenager knows something about tension holding. On one hand, you have this vision of your child's promise and potential. On the other hand, you're aware of their limitations. And meanwhile, you're watching them make some bad decisions and pay the prices. We hold this tension together in different ways, but we know this as good parents. This is much more difficult on a national level, of course, simply because a large number of people. And that difficulty is magnified in many ways by the mass media that showers us with such fast-paced flow of one crisis after another, presented to us in black and white choices, hitting us in microbites that are difficult to understand. We forget the wisdom and the evidence that comes from our own lives. A story Parker shares about this habit goes like this. People have a harder time dismissing or demonizing each other politically when they know a bit of each other's personal stories. A while back, he was talking with a business lobbyist. The lobbyist was arguing that business had no responsibilities to anyone except investors and stockholders. Eventually, he turned to Parker, "So what's your position on that?" Parker's inner response was, "I disagree with you totally," but he didn't think that kind of argument would be fruitful. So he said, "Let me tell you a story. My dad came to Chicago from Iowa in the Great Depression, 19 years old, from a blue-collar family with a high school diploma. He got a temporary bookkeeping job with a firm that sold chinaware and silverware to hotels, restaurants, railroads, and later Airlines. Eventually, he was hired as a salesman, and 50 years later, he was owner and chairman of the board of E.A. Hendricks and Company. Dad was deeply grateful to a society that allowed him to fulfill some dreams, and he believed in using his company to give others a leg up whenever possible. So he sometimes hired people who weren't the best or the brightest, but had potential. One was a truck driver named Dusty, who often made trouble with late deliveries, traffic tickets, etc. I heard a lot of stories about Dusty, his latest screw-up, and what Dad was trying to teach him. One night, when I was 14 years old, after yet another story, I said, "Dad, why don't you fire the guy? He causes so much trouble." My father looked shocked and said sternly, "But Hart, the man has a wife and 3 children. Where else would he get a job?" So that is why I believe that business has a responsibility to folks beyond investors and stockholders. For my dad, doing well in business and doing good in the world through his business went hand in hand. That is why I believe what I believe. There was a moment of silence. Then his conversation partner said very quietly, "Well, of course, that's true." Parker shared that he doesn't know what happened inside that lobbyist. What he does know is that he helped create a safe space for the dialogue to continue. To renew we the people, we need lots of these safe spaces where people can talk across political division. We need to learn that in the long run, it's more important to be in right relationship than to be right. The UU principles are a little more challenging to line up with this habit. However, I believe Parker is talking about our second principle: justice, equality, and compassion in human relations. As you go through this week, consider how this habit and principle are present in your life with these questions. What is a challenge that you see our community facing that seems to bring up a lot of tension for people? What are the most successful ways you've seen people deal with that tension? Oops. There we go. The fourth habit of Hart is a sense of personal voice and agency. If we are to take advantage of these energizing potentials, we need to speak and act. Not only to express our truth, but to allow others to check and correct it as they speak and act in response. But many Americans have little confidence in their own voices or in their power to make a difference. For many reasons, including the fact that our educational and many religious institutions tend to teach us how to be an audience to a performance rather than participants in a drama. Fortunately, at Westside, we don't have that, right? We are a surprisingly passive people, but there are ways to find one's voice and learn how to speak it, and to know how it feels to make a difference when one does. We must offer such opportunities to more and more people if we want them to be agents of democracy's renewal. Again, this habit doesn't exactly connect with the UU principle, but I think there's more to this habit than just the fourth principle of a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. I believe Parker is encouraging us to speak up about our search for truth and share what we know for the common good. As you go through this week, consider this habit and the third principle as it lives in your world when you consider these questions. When was a time in your life when you spoke out, either in speech, writing, or action, and saw the power of your own agency? When was the time you thought about speaking out and didn't? And when and where do you feel most voiceless in your day-to-day life? The fifth and final habit of Hart is a capacity to create community. Learning to speak and act as an individual does not contradict community, but requires it. You can't have one without the other. History consistently teaches us that voice and agency are nearly impossible to achieve, let alone to exercise, when there is little or no community in our lives. It takes the support and encouragement of a village to raise up a Rosa Parks. In a mass society like ours, fewer and fewer opportunities for community are ready made in our lives, but there are many ways to plant and cultivate the seeds of community, small and large, in the places where we live and work. The companionship of 2 or 3 people can sometimes make a great difference. We must help each other become gardeners of community if we want democracy to flourish. This habit aligns with our 6th principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Working together, consider these questions this week. What are the gifts and challenges of being in community for you? How are you creating a caring neighborhood in your own community, and the community at large? So I invite you to read Parker Palmer's entire book. He is an exceptional storyteller, and the book is full of rich stories, more than I've shared with you this morning. I also invite you to consider the questions that I've posed today with each of these habits. How can you begin to heal the heart of democracy in your own family, your own neighborhood, in our city? I also invite us into a deeper discussion around these habits towards strengthening our West Side community. I'll close today with one more story from Parker. He added this story to the introduction of the paperback version of Healing the Heart of Democracy that just came out this fall. And his story goes, in March of 2011, shortly after Parker sent the final draft of the book to the publisher, he had an experience that brought to life much of what he had written about in the book. Parker participated in the annual 3-day Congressional Civil Rights Pilgrimage, sponsored by Faith and Politics Institute in Washington, D.C., and led by Congressman John Lewis. The pilgrimage began in Birmingham, Alabama, moved on to Montgomery, and ended in Selma, where they marked the 46th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, a pivotal event in American political history. On Sunday, March 7, 1965, 600 nonviolent protesters, many of them young, gathered at the foot of Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge to begin the 50-mile march to the Alabama State Capitol in Montgomery, a protest against the ongoing exclusion of African Americans from the electoral process. When they reached the other side of the bridge, the marchers were brutalized by state and local police, mounted and on foot, with billy clubs and tear gas. This atrocity, witnessed on television by millions of Americans, scandalized the nation. But it also generated enough political momentum in Congress that President Lyndon Johnson was able to sign a Voting Rights Act into law just 5 months later. The 1965 march across Edmund Pettus Bridge was led by John Lewis, a 25-year-old and chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. As leader, he was one of the first to be beaten by the police, who fractured his skull and left marks he bears to this day. This experience left another kind of mark on Parker in March 2011 as they recreated this. He followed the 71-year-old John Lewis, United States Representative from Georgia's 5th Congressional District since 1987, and winner of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He followed him across the bridge where 46 years earlier he had led others in the courageous exercise of people power. The 25-year-old John Lewis and his age mates of the civil rights movement were the descendants of generations of people who had suffered the worst America has to offer, but had not given up on the vision of freedom, justice, and equality that represents the country at its best. Those people nurtured that vision in their children, in their grandchildren, in their neighborhoods, in their classrooms, in their churches especially, creating a steady, multi-generational stream of underground activity that was largely invisible to white Americans, until it rose up to claim our attention in the 1950s and 1960s. By accident, Parker sat just behind John Lewis on the bus that day they recreated. And John was telling one of his staffers a story. Also in 1961, he and a friend were at a bus station in Rock Hill, South Carolina, when several young white men attacked and beat them bloody with baseball bats. Lewis and his friend did not fight back, and they declined to press charges. They simply treated their wounds and went on about their civil rights work. In 2009, 48 years after this event, a white man about John Lewis's age walked into his office on Capitol Hill, accompanied by his middle-aged son. "Mr. Lewis," he said, "my name is Elvin Wilson. I'm one of the men who beat you in that bus station back in 1961. I want to atone for the terrible thing I did, so I've come to seek your forgiveness. Will you forgive?" Lewis said, "I forgave him. We embraced. He and his son and I wept, and then we talked." As Lewis came to the end of this remarkable and moving story, he leaned back in his seat on the bus. He gazed out the window for a while as we passed through the countryside that was once the killing ground of the Ku Klux Klan, of which Elvin Wilson had been a member. Then a very soft voice, as if he speaking to himself about the story he had just told and all the memories that must have been coming and moving in him, Lewis said, "People can change. People can change." May we be faithful to the better angels of our nature and to what they call forth from us. May we be faithful to the call of courage that summons us to witness the common good. May we know and feel in the core of our being the habits of the heart, and through our lived experiences and actions, help heal the heart of democracy in our world. Thank you, and as we rise in body or spirit, please join in singing our closing hymn, number 121, "We'll Build the Land."